what is clear about the slave trade is that war was the motor that led to enslavement. And so that war captives became slaves. So war in the interior of Africa, and close to the coast, the victims of the wars between the various societies and between the elites, the powerful in the various societies, generated certain numbers of captives who were then sold. And we gave some figures for that period. It's a big debate, but it gives you an idea of the millions who were enslaved in Africa. And we said so many of the European powers were involved in it. The Danish, the French, all of these companies, and with the backings of their states, had established trading stations on the coast of Africa. Now, the interesting thing is that, can I just use this here as a marker? The slave trade was abolished. There's an important series of events that happens from about, so we ended up around 1800. From 1808, the trade is abolished. The slave trade is abolished, okay? So Britain is the first country to abolish the slave trade. Okay? Abolition, this is the word. Abolition. Slave trade is abolished, and the main force behind the abolition was based in England, and these abolitionists, those who were for the abolition of the slave trade, abolitionists, argued on the basis of religion and on the basis of the human condition, the ideas that were emerging in Europe at the time about the nature of the human being born free, etc., etc. So there's a change happening in Europe intellectually about the view of the human being, that all humans are equal, etc., etc. And it finds support among certain religious elements in Britain. And they push for the abolition of the slave trade. Okay. The next step is in the 1830s, from 1834 to 8. It's the actual abolition of slavery itself. So firstly, to trade in it, it's illegal, but to hold slaves isn't illegal. Only in this time does it become illegal to hold slaves. This is in the British Empire. Okay, so this is slavery itself. Now, the British Empire, by this point, extended to Canada. The United States had already large settlements, and the Caribbean, certain parts of Africa where the slaves were coming from, in the east, India, etc., etc. Now, why did they do this? There is an argument by a Caribbean historian called Eric Williams. He was from the Caribbean, and he basically argued that capitalism, the nature of the capitalist system, determined that there was no longer a need for slavery. So basically, the global economy, insofar as the British was concerned, there was no longer need for slavery, and this ideology of abolitionism served this new economic phase of so-called free labor. Do you get the point? So basically, that the cause of abolitionism wasn't so much about being good to other people of another color or who were unfortunate to be enslaved, but because the global economy needed a different type of labor. Okay, not the labor of people enchained and organized into gangs to work and forced and so on. You needed another kind of labor regime. So that's been a very powerful argument that it's not simply the case of new good feelings emerging. What is important to remember also is that slave trade, despite this, how do you actually police it? So the British had a few squadrons in the sea, in the Atlantic and and in the Indian Ocean, policing the sea, which is basically impossible. So you had slave vessels basically skirting around, and now and again they would be able to block a ship with slaves and then set them free. This happened throughout the 19th century. But slavery, the slave trade continued. And what is interesting for Eric Williams in his argument, he says that the abolitionists, those who were for the abolition of slave trade, they concentrated on the West Indies, on the sugar plantations and the freeing of slaves. And why didn't they focus on Brazil? Brazil was an even bigger slave society, because the demands of the Brazilian economy was for continued slavery. You get the point? So they focused on the area where they felt slavery wasn't serving the purpose anymore. In other areas where it did serve its purpose, they conveniently forgot it. They conveniently didn't raise the issue there. Anyway, it's a big debate between economic historians over this, but it's a powerful argument where he's pointing out it's not simply good feelings where they said free the slaves and so on. I think there was a movie recently about William Wilberforce. William Wilberforce. He was one of the key British intellectuals who argued on a very strong moral grounds. You can watch this movie, you can get at least that perspective of the moral argument of that slavery is immoral. Okay, so it's a movie, I think it's simply called Wilberforce. It came out with the sort of anniversary of the abolition and so on. Okay, now what happens it's very uneven. So this trade doesn't actually stop. The trade continues from Africa into Brazil into the 1890s. The trade continues. Slavery, the practice of slavery doesn't end. In America, they have to go to war to end it. Okay, in Africa, they continue to enslave people. African elites continue to slave other Africans they capture in war. Now they can't sell them because it's more difficult to sell them, but so they keep them in their own communities. As I said last week, slavery was mainly men who went off the continent and women who were kept in the continent. It was a very different system on the continent. Lots of incorporation into the family. In the Muslim societies, if there was a child born of a union between a slave owner and a slave, the child was free, and there was a high rate of manumission, of setting of people free. But it also led to the demand for new slaves. And one should see it in the first place as a system of labor mobilization. Why would you want slaves? If you just want to have slaves, in fact, it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you to feed them. It's going to cost you to have security over them. So what is this? This is a way of mobilizing people to work on your fields, to work in your, and to that you can sell again and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, I'm repeating what I said last week because with the abolition of slavery, this new phase begins that really begins the occupation of Africa, the European penetration deeper into the continent. Okay? So that's the phase, the beginnings of empire, and it's called informal empire. informal. The abolition and the slave trade was had three things that went against it. It was characterized in three C's. Three C's, it is often said, led to its end. And this is how, in Britain, the intellectuals behind the abolition, they had the three C's. And the C's that was going to abolish slavery and end it for good was commerce. Commerce, legitimate commerce. In other words, not commerce in human beings, okay? Legitimate. So it was legitimate trade. Trade in products, trade in goods, trade in raw materials. Commerce, then civilization. The idea was the Africans were uncivilized, they were selling and trading in this. We need to spread civilization. And civilization is against slavery and those things. We must push civilization. And what will be the core of the civilization we push will be other C. It will be what? Christianity. Okay, so those are the three C's that meets at the abolition and then leads to empire. The empire initially is not formal occupation, is not formal British or French or Portuguese landing their armies and occupying and saying this is ours. It is firstly informal penetration from the coast, okay? What we do see, initially, you had the coastlines were basically fairly temporary, on the whole, trading posts. A company would have a post there, the Africans would bring the slaves, or they would bring their goods, and so on. In the course of the first half of the 19th century, especially after the abolition, they begin to establish more permanent posts and go much more deeper into the interior, usually along the coast, along the rivers, the Senegal River, the Niger River. They penetrate, and the private companies get the backing of the state, of the British Army or the French Army, to push into the interior. Now they become more permanent. They're not interested only. They're no longer interested in slaves. There are other demands. They are sending explorers into the interior. This is the great age of exploration. So they write about all sorts of things that they discover in Africa. This is when people like Stanley, in this period, in this long 19th century period, Stanley, Livingstone, the exploration of Africa. They had heard that there's wealth there, there's gold, there's minerals. You know, Britain in the 19th century is going through a massive period of economic growth. And generally Europe with the Industrial Revolution, very important turning point in all of this. In the late 19th century, through the development of the railways, the development of steel industries and iron and all these things, it's unparalleled economic expansion that lays the basis for the 20th century. So there's a need for ever more markets for your materials to sell. Who must we sell these things to? We want to sell more of our things to more people, more countries, and we want more raw materials. Well, let's see where we can get gold and anything. Later it becomes rubber for the development of the wheel for the car, and so on and so forth. This is all fascinating stuff. It's about material things, material objects, cotton, linen. Think of the stuff that we take for granted now today that emerges during this period, and they begin to penetrate. And there's this marriage between the private sector and the state sector. The private company and the government, the military. The military is sent in. So it's not that, so therefore the economic analysis of the causes for the abolition and the cause for deeper penetration to Africa is so important. If we look at what happened in South Africa, it was the private exploration for diamonds and gold under people like Cecil John Rhodes and others that led to expansion into the interior, and that led to the South African War, and so on and so forth, over the raw materials of the country. This is the story that happens in the course of the 19th century, from about the period of the abolition.